The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, a sharp, biting pressure that grounded her in the sudden, violent reality of the night. A police siren wailed, its rhythmic pulse cutting through the heavy Seoul air like a funeral dirge. She stood beneath the harsh, flickering blue of the police lights, the glare washing out the street and turning the world into a series of jagged, high-contrast shadows. Every breath felt thin. The sound of the siren bounced off the nearby buildings, creating an echo that made the alleyway feel smaller, tighter, and inescapable. She stared at the flashing lights, her vision blurring as the reality of the situation took hold. There was no room to move, no space to argue, and no one to call. The city, which had once been a place of anonymity, now felt like a cage closing in. She shifted her weight, but the steel restraints held firm, digging deeper into her skin. The silence between the siren's wails was worse than the noise itself, a heavy, suffocating quiet that signaled the end of everything she had built. She looked up at the dark windows of the surrounding towers, but they remained blind, indifferent to the scene unfolding below. She was trapped, and the night was only just beginning. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Now, let's start from the very beginning. She remembered the sliding glass doors parting, letting in the rush of air that smelled of jet fuel and possibility. She had walked through that terminal with nothing but a single suitcase, its weight dragging slightly on her shoulder. The floor was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the thousands of people moving in every direction, none of them noticing the woman who wanted to be invisible. She had stood by the baggage claim, watching the carousel spin, waiting for a life that hadn't yet begun. The air in the terminal was climate-controlled, lacking the grit of the streets, but it felt like a clean slate. She had gripped the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles turned white, a silent pact with herself to never look back. Every step toward the exit felt like a deliberate move away from her past. At that moment, the future was just a series of empty streets waiting for her to walk them. Before the neon lights of Seoul, there was the red dust of home. She had grown up in a landscape where survival required a steady hand and a spine that did not bend. Her days in London were marked by a rhythmic, unrelenting pace. She managed the logistics of a small family business, moving crates, balancing ledgers, and navigating the chaotic pulse of the local market with a quiet, guarded strength. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority came from the way she stood her ground when others retreated, and the way she finished every task before the sun dipped below the horizon. But the walls of that life began to feel too close. She saw the same faces, walked the same paths, and felt the weight of expectations that were not her own. She began to crave a place where no one knew her history, where she could be a ghost in a crowd. She spent months planning, saving every coin, and sharpening her focus until the decision crystallized into a single, irreversible action. She packed one bag, left the keys on the counter, and walked out of the house without looking back. The convenience store in Mapogu became her entire world. It was a narrow, cramped space that smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. She started her shifts at midnight, the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a persistent, irritating buzz that never quite stopped. Her hands moved in a practiced, rhythmic blur, pulling stock from cardboard boxes and lining up bottles on the shelves with surgical precision. She spent hours checking expiration dates, wiping down the glass of the refrigerated units, and rearranging the snack displays until every item sat perfectly flush. Customers drifted in and out, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of the registers, but they never looked at her. To them, she was just a fixture of the store, as functional and unnoticed as the checkout scanner. She learned to anticipate their needs before they spoke. When the store was empty, she stood behind the counter, staring out at the dark street, listening to the rain tap against the glass. She was a ghost in a room filled with goods, existing in the gaps between transactions, her presence entirely defined by the labor she performed. When her shift ended, the street outside felt like a different planet. Seoul did not sleep. It vibrated. She stepped onto the sidewalk, and the neon signs above hit her with a relentless artificial glare. Reds, blues, and electric yellows bled into the wet pavement, creating a kaleidoscope of light that made everything look distorted. Thousands of people moved around her, a river of bodies flowing in every direction, yet no one made eye contact. She walked with her head down, weaving through the thick, rushing crowds. The sound was a constant roar. She felt the pressure of the city pushing against her, a physical weight that demanded she move faster, be louder, or simply vanish. She stopped at a busy intersection, waiting for the light to change, and watched the faces of the commuters. She was a ghost in the neon blur, a silent observer in a city that had no room for her history or her name. The store became a fortress, built of inventory. Elena returned to the aisles, finding a strange, cold comfort in the repetition. She focused on the labels, aligning them with the shelf edges until the store looked like a grid of perfect order. Her hands knew the weight of every bottle, the exact tension of every plastic seal. She didn't think about the city outside, or the life she had left behind. She thought about the inventory count. She thought about the dust on the bottom shelf. She thought about the precise angle required to stack the energy drinks so they wouldn't topple. This was her defense. By burying herself in the mundane, she created a wall that the chaos of Seoul could not penetrate. The hum of the refrigerator motors became a steady, rhythmic pulse that drowned out the sirens and the shouting from the street. Every item placed was a victory over the uncertainty of her existence. She was finally in control of her own small, silent universe. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a low, persistent buzz that usually faded into the background. Elena was mid-reach, sliding a row of water bottles forward when the automatic door chime cut through the silence. It was a sharp, electronic trill that sounded too loud in the empty shop. She didn't look up immediately, keeping her focus on the shelf. But the air in the store changed. The temperature seemed to drop. A heavy, deliberate footfall sounded on the linoleum floor, moving past the snack aisles with a rhythm that felt entirely out of place. It wasn't the hurried shuffle of a late-night customer. It was slow, measured, and purposeful. Elena finished aligning the final bottle, her fingers lingering on the plastic for a second longer than necessary. She took a breath, feeling the weight of a gaze that was already fixed on her. She turned, her movements practiced and neutral, and found the aisle empty. The man had bypassed the shelves entirely. He simply stood there, and the controlled world began to fray. He did not look at the shelves. He did not look at the price tags or the rows of neatly stacked goods. Min-jae kept his eyes locked on Elena, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying a complex machine. The silence in the store grew thick, pressing against the glass windows. Elena gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She waited for him to ask for a receipt, to reach for a pack of cigarettes, or to make the standard inquiry of a customer. He did none of these things. He simply stood, a dark silhouette against the flickering store lights, his presence demanding a response she did not want to give. She tried to look past him, focusing on the street outside, but his stare was a physical weight. It pulled her attention back, forcing her to meet his eyes. There was no warmth in his expression, only a sharp, analytical intensity that seemed to strip away her defenses. The air between them hummed with an unspoken question. For the first time since she arrived in Seoul, the store did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a stage, and she was suddenly, uncomfortably, the only person in the spotlight. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, the door chime ringing out into the empty street. Elena stood frozen, the silence returning to the store, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt hollow. The next night, at exactly the same hour, the chime sounded again. He walked in, stopped at the counter, and placed a single coin on the glass. No words, just a nod. This became the rhythm of her nights. Every evening, he appeared, a constant shadow in the fluorescent glare. The barrier between them began to thin. One night, he asked about the origin of the tea she stocked. The next, he lingered to comment on the rain. Elena found herself anticipating the chime, her eyes drifting to the door long before he arrived. She stopped keeping her hands busy with inventory, choosing instead to stand ready. When he spoke, She stopped giving clipped, one-word answers. She began to offer sentences, small fragments of her own history, testing the weight of her voice in the space he created. The walls she had built to keep the city out were not being torn down. They were being dismantled, one quiet conversation at a time, until the store felt less like a cage and more like a bridge. The convenience store became a quiet theater for their growing familiarity. The transactions grew shorter, replaced by questions that had nothing to do with goods or currency. Elena spoke of the heat in a city she had left behind, describing the way the dust settled on the leaves after a storm. She did not look at him while she spoke, keeping her gaze fixed on the rows of glass bottles, but she felt his focus sharpen. Min-jae listened with a stillness that was rare in the frantic pulse of Seoul. He did not offer empty comfort. Instead, he shared a fragment of his own life, a brief mention of the endless, sterile boardrooms he navigated, the weight of decisions that never seemed to end. It was not a confession, but it was an admission of exhaustion. Elena looked up then, meeting his eyes, and saw the flicker of something raw beneath his composure. There were two people hiding in plain sight, finding a strange, temporary safety in the shared recognition of their own burdens. The store lights seemed to dim, the hum of the refrigerator fading into the background as they navigated the fragile territory of trust. Every word exchanged was a brick removed from the wall. The chime rang, but he did not approach the counter. Min-jae stood by the door, his hand resting on the frame, his gaze fixed on the street outside. He turned to her, the fluorescent lights reflecting in his eyes, and offered a simple gesture toward the exit. No explanation followed, only a silent invitation. Elena hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the register. She looked at the familiar, cluttered shelves, then back at him. The store had been her only tether to safety, but the air inside felt suddenly thin. She stepped out from behind the counter, the bell chiming again as she crossed the threshold into the cool night. They walked through the city in silence, the neon signs blurring into streaks of color against the pavement. He led her away from the main thoroughfares, through a heavy steel door, and up a series of concrete stairs that echoed with their footsteps. When they reached the top, the city expanded beneath them. The Han River stretched out like a dark, obsidian ribbon, reflecting the distant glow of the skyline. Elena walked to the edge, the vastness of the space forcing her to breathe deeper than she had in months. The noise of the streets below faded into a distant, rhythmic hum. Min-jae leaned against the rusted railing, his back to the sprawling lights of the city. He did not look at the skyline. He looked at his own hands, resting flat against the cold metal. The rigid posture he maintained in the store began to unravel. He let his shoulders drop, a slow, deliberate release of tension that seemed to age him by a decade. He spoke, his voice stripped of its usual sharp, commanding edge. It was low, raspy, and carried the weight of years. He described the boardrooms not as places of success, but as cages where every breath was measured and every word was a trap. He talked about the exhaustion that never left him, a fatigue that lived in his bones, untouched by sleep or silence. Elena watched him, seeing the man behind the image for the first time. He was not the powerful figure the city feared. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, no longer guarded. The heavy, invisible armor he carried fell away. Elena moved closer, the space between them closing until the cold air no longer mattered. She watched the way he held himself, no longer braced for an impact that never came. The silence was no longer a weapon, it was a bridge. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before she rested it against the rough texture of his sleeve. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He leaned into the touch, a small, involuntary movement that spoke more than any confession. For the first time since arriving in this city, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety in her chest went quiet. She had spent months moving through the streets like a ghost, unseen and unreachable. But here, under the vast, uncaring sky, she was anchored. She looked at his face, seeing the lines of fatigue and the flicker of something softer, something human. It was not just a shared secret, it was a recognition. The city lights continued to pulse below, but they were no longer a blur of indifference. They were merely background to the stillness they had built between them. The serenity of the rooftop did not last. As they turned to leave, the wind shifted, carrying the faint, rhythmic sound of heavy boots against concrete from the stairwell below. Elena paused, her hand still resting near Min-jae's. She looked over the railing, scanning the alleyway 3 stories down. A shadow detached itself from the brickwork, moving with a calculated, predatory grace that did not belong to a casual passerby. She looked at Min-jae. His jaw had tightened, the softness she had seen moments ago replaced by a sharp scanning intensity. He did not speak, but his hand moved to her elbow, guiding her away from the edge and into the deeper gloom of the rooftop entrance. The city, which had felt like a distant backdrop, now seemed to press in on them. Every flickering neon sign felt like an eye tracking their path. They reached the street level, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward them, long and hungry, as if the city itself were closing its trap. Elena reached her apartment door, her fingers fumbling with the keys as she tried to shake off the lingering sense of being followed. She stepped inside, the familiar, cramped space offering a momentary illusion of safety. She slid the deadbolt into place, the metallic click echoing in the small room. She had barely turned around when the wood groaned under a massive, singular impact. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. A second blow followed, louder and more deliberate, splintering the frame near the lock. The door bucked inward, the hinges screaming as they tore from the wall. Before she could move toward the window, the door flew off its hinges, crashing onto the floorboards with a deafening thud. Heavy boots thundered into the room. Elena was shoved backward, her spine slamming against the cold plaster of the far wall. The room was suddenly filled with harsh, artificial light and the sharp, rhythmic commands of officers. She raised her hands, her vision blurring as the space she had called home was overrun. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and aggressive intent. In the span of a single heartbeat, the quiet life she had built in this city was dismantled. The lead officer stepped into her personal space, his face a mask of professional detachment. He did not look for contraband. He looked at her with a cold, piercing intensity that made her skin crawl. He pulled a thick file from his jacket and slapped it onto the small table near her bed. The sound was sharp, final. He began to recite a list of charges that made no sense to her. Corporate espionage, data theft, sabotage of a major conglomerate. Elena shook her head, her pulse hammering against her throat. She tried to speak, to ask what they were talking about, but the officer raised a hand, cutting her off instantly. He didn't want a defense, he wanted a confession. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of these accusations settled over her. She looked at the officers surrounding her, their expressions devoid of empathy, their movements mechanical and precise. Her mind raced, trying to find a foothold, but there was only the cold, hard reality of the handcuffs and the overwhelming, suffocating pressure. The officer flipped the file open, sliding a series of glossy prints across the metal table. Elena stared down at them, her breath catching. The first photo showed her standing in a lobby she did not recognize, engaged in a hushed conversation with a man she had never met. She blinked, her eyes darting to the next image. It was her again, this time near a server room, holding a flash drive. The lighting was perfect, the angles precise, but the events were entirely fabricated. She looked up at the officer, her voice trembling as she denied the scenes depicted. He ignored her, tapping a finger against the paper, his expression smug. The images were too clean, too deliberate. She realized then that these were not mistakes. They were blueprints for her destruction. Every detail, from the angle of her head to the background blur, had been meticulously crafted. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not just a suspect. She was a target in a game played by architects she could not see. The walls of the room seemed to vibrate with the weight of the lie, and for the first time, she understood that the truth was no longer a defense. Elena stared at the glossy prints until the faces blurred. She was not a person to these people. She was a variable to be removed. The corporate logos on the documents in the file were names she had seen on billboards across Seoul, monolithic entities that dictated the flow of the city. She understood now that she had been chosen for her invisibility. A foreign worker with no local connections, no family, and no resources was the perfect vessel for their manufactured scandal. She tried to trace the logic of the frame-up, looking for a single point of failure, but the structure was seamless. Every piece of evidence was designed to lead to a dead end. She was a pawn being sacrificed to protect a king she had never met. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing against her ears. She looked at her own hands, steady despite the chaos, and realized that her innocence was a liability rather than a shield. The architects of this trap had calculated her reaction, her fear, and her eventual silence. She was trapped in a game where the rules were written in code she could not read, and the board was tilted entirely against her. The realization left her cold, a hollow ache settling in her chest as the full scope of her isolation became clear. Elena reached for the memory of Min-jae, her only anchor in the storm. She closed her eyes, trying to visualize the rooftop, the way he had looked at her when the city lights reflected in his eyes. She needed him to know. She needed him to speak. She mentally traced the number she had memorized, the digits that represented her only path to safety. But the silence in the room was absolute. She imagined the phone ringing in his pocket, a sound that would never come. She tried to recall his last words, searching for a hidden meaning, or a warning she might have missed. But his voice was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile hum of the police station. She checked her pockets, desperate for a scrap of paper or a digital trace, but found only the empty lining of her coat. He had not just left, he had erased himself. Every place they had walked, every corner they had turned, now felt like a stage set that had been dismantled the moment she stepped off. The betrayal cut deeper than the handcuffs. She had trusted a ghost, and now, the ghost had dissolved into the neon haze, leaving her to face the war alone. The interrogation room was a concrete box, stripped of everything but a table, 2 chairs, and a single, buzzing fluorescent tube. Elena watched the light flicker, a rhythmic pulse that marked the seconds of her life ticking away. The walls were painted a dull, institutional gray, stained by the dampness of the city. She pressed her palms against the cold metal of the table, feeling the vibrations of the building through the floor. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of the station shouting, heavy footsteps. The clatter of keyboards reminded her that she was a speck in a machine that did not care if she lived or died. A detective entered, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He did not speak. He simply placed a thick file on the table and slid it toward her. The weight of the paper felt like a death sentence. She looked at the door, then back at the detective, realizing that no one was coming to open it for her. The reality of a foreign prison, a place where her name would be replaced by a number, settled into her bones. She was thousands of miles from home. Deep within the concrete bowels of the station, Elena remained motionless. She did not know that the room was not as empty as it seemed. High above the interrogation floor, 3 levels removed from the reach of the detectives, a small, black lens hummed with activity. It was a hidden eye, tucked into the corner of the ceiling, capturing every tremor in her hands and every shallow breath she took. 3 floors up, the feed played out in real time. Min-jae sat in the silence of an office that smelled of ozone and stale coffee. He leaned forward, his focus locked onto the monitor. He watched Elena reach for the edge of the table, his own fingers mirroring the movement against the cold surface of his desk. He saw the way she looked at the door, the way she braced herself against the inevitable. He was not a ghost, and he had not vanished. He was the architect of a hidden layer of reality, watching the chess pieces move from a vantage point no one else could see. Min-jae was waiting for the precise moment to intervene, his gaze never leaving the screen that held her life in its flickering digital glow. In the office, the overhead lights hummed once before clicking off, plunging the room into a deep, artificial twilight. The only illumination came from the wall of monitors, casting a jagged blue-white glow across the desk. Min-jae did not move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes scanning the data streams that crawled across the glass. The screens flickered, showing different angles of the station, the hallways, and the restricted access points where the frame-up had been orchestrated. He reached out, his hand hovering over the keyboard, and tapped a single key. A map of the city's internal network appeared, pulsing with red nodes that marked the digital footprints of his enemies. He traced the connection back to a server farm in the district, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. Every movement he made was precise, economical, and devoid of hesitation. He was not just watching anymore. He was mapping the architecture of their downfall. He leaned into the light, his reflection ghosting over the images of the people who had tried to bury her. He was ready. Min-jae's fingers hit the keys with the speed of a machine. He bypassed the first layer of encryption in seconds, his eyes darting across lines of scrolling green code. A wall of red text flashed on the primary monitor, a defensive protocol designed to lock him out. He did not blink. He shifted his grip, his knuckles white against the plastic, and initiated a brute force override. The cursor pulsed, then turned white, signaling the breach. He was inside their private network now. He began to pull the threads of the frame-up apart, dragging files from hidden directories and dumping them into the public logs. He watched as the rival conglomerate server load spiked, their internal systems struggling to process the sudden influx of incriminating data. He deleted their backups, erased their access logs, and planted a recursive loop that would keep their systems locked in a cycle of error reports. He was dismantling their influence, one packet at a time. The room grew warmer as the computer fans whirred, struggling to keep up. Min-jae stopped. His hands hovered over the keyboard, motionless. On the secondary screen, Elena sat in the interrogation room, her head bowed, the harsh fluorescent light washing out her features. A secure phone sat on the corner of his desk, its screen dark. He reached for it, his thumb brushing the glass, then pulled back. He knew the risks. The police department was not just a building, it was a listening post. Every frequency, every encrypted line, every cellular handshake in that precinct was being logged and analyzed by the very people who had put her there. He watched her on the monitor, his jaw tightening until the muscles ached. He had to remain a ghost. He had to let the evidence speak for him, because his voice was a liability she could not afford. He pushed the phone away, turned back to the glowing lines of code, and resumed his work, his movements now fueled by a cold, calculated fury. Min-jae returned to the terminal, his focus narrowing to the specific digital trail the conspirators had planted. He located the primary database entries that linked Elena to the stolen data. With a series of precise keystrokes, he began the process of digital sanitation. He didn't just delete the files, he scrubbed the metadata, overwriting the timestamps and location logs with neutral, untraceable information. A tracking algorithm triggered, attempting to flag his intrusion. He anticipated the response, deploying a counterscript that fed the algorithm a stream of corrupted, recursive data. The system stalled, caught in a loop of its own verification protocols. He used the distraction to finalize the rewrite. He replaced the forged meeting logs with authentic records of her actual whereabouts during the time of the alleged theft. He systematically dismantled the digital evidence of her presence at the crime scene, replacing it with a void. Every server he touched became a dead end for the investigators. He watched as the digital profile of the woman they had framed began to dissolve, replaced by a clean, unremarkable history. The screen flickered as the final overwrite took hold. With the digital trail cleared, Min-jae shifted his focus to the source of the deception. He traced the origin of the forged data packets, following the digital breadcrumbs back through a series of encrypted proxies. The cooling fans in the office began to whine, a low hum that filled the room. He hit a massive firewall, a digital fortress designed to protect the internal communications of the rival conglomerate. He did not try to break the wall. He found a vulnerability in the update protocol, a backdoor left open by a careless administrator. He slipped through, his presence masked. He navigated the internal network, moving past payroll, legal, and human resources until he reached the executive server. He accessed the logs for the date of the frame-up. There, He found the smoking gun, a direct command sent from the CEO's private terminal to the team that had manufactured the evidence. He pulled the logs, copied the correspondence, and mapped the internal IP addresses of every participant involved in the conspiracy. The screen displayed a map of the corporate headquarters, highlighting the specific office. He had found the architects of the lie. Min-jae did not hesitate. He compiled the stolen logs, the internal emails, and the financial records into a single, encrypted package. He routed the data through a global network of public servers, ensuring the leak could not be traced back to his terminal. As he hit the final command, a red warning flashed on his screen, a last-ditch automated security sweep attempting to quarantine the files. He countered by flooding the network with a massive packet of junk data, forcing the security protocols to prioritize the noise over the leak. The progress bar surged forward. Within seconds, the files were live. He watched the impact unfold on a secondary monitor. The information hit the public sphere like a shockwave. Private messages and financial records detailing the bribes were uploaded to public forums. The conspirators' personal secrets were stripped bare. He watched as the targets scrambled, their phones lighting up with frantic notifications. He sat back, the glow of the screen reflecting the cold, systematic ruin he had unleashed upon those who had tried to destroy her. Inside the police station, the lead detective sat at his desk, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A notification chimed on his terminal, an anonymous file transfer. He clicked the icon, expecting a routine report from the field. Instead, a folder opened, containing the raw logs and internal communications Min-jae had just leaked. He scanned the first page, then the second, his brow furrowed. He cross-referenced the timestamps with the case file on his desk. The discrepancies were impossible to ignore. He pulled up the original evidence folder, the one used to justify the arrest, and compared it to the new data. The images were doctored. The digital signatures were forged. He stood up, pacing the small, cramped office, his boots clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. He tried to trace the source of the file, but the connection was dead, masked by layers of encryption that refused to yield. He looked toward the holding cells, then back at his monitor. The reality of the situation took hold. The entire investigation was a fabrication, a hollow shell built on lies to serve a corporate agenda. He slumped back into his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the sweat on his forehead. He reached for his radio, stopped, and pulled his hand back. He was holding the truth. Min-jae watched the detective struggle with the truth, but he knew the man needed a final push. He bypassed the remaining firewalls with a series of rapid, precise keystrokes. He didn't just send a file. He injected a persistent, unremovable digital signature into the core of the department's server. A command prompt appeared on every monitor in the station, overriding all active investigations. The screen flickered, then turned a stark, warning red. The IT department attempted a hard reboot, but Min-jae had already hard-coded a lock on the boot sequence. He sent a single text-based message that pulsed across every terminal in the building. It was a direct warning, detailing the specific names of the officers involved. In the frame-up, and the exact location of the falsified evidence, the station erupted into chaos. Keyboards clattered as officers tried to regain control, but the system remained frozen. Every printer in the building began to churn out the same document, the proof of the conspiracy. The digital signature was a declaration of war, a signal that the department was no longer in control. Min-jae leaned back, watching the panic through the security feeds. The lead detective stood up, his movements stiff and mechanical. He grabbed the folder from his desk, the paper edges sharp against his palms. He walked down the narrow corridor of the detention wing, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Every cell he passed was silent, the occupants watching him with hollow, expectant eyes. He reached the end of the hall and stopped in front of Elena's door. He looked at the folder, then at the heavy steel lock. He took a breath, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged motions. He inserted the key and turned it. The mechanism clicked, a sharp, final sound that cut through the stagnant air. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. His face was drained of color, his skin pale under the harsh overhead light. He didn't speak at first. He simply held the folder out, his hand trembling slightly. He dropped it onto the small metal table between them. The impact sounded like a gavel. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide and fixed on the floor, unable to meet her gaze. He muttered a single, strained sentence, confirming the files proved she had no connection to the data theft. Elena stood up, her pulse thrumming in her throat as she stared at the papers. Elena pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the corridor. The station was in total disarray. Officers were shouting into radios, and the printers were still churning out stacks of paper. She kept her head down, moving with a steady, measured pace toward the main exit. Nobody stopped her. The detectives who had interrogated her hours ago were now huddled around terminals, their focus entirely consumed by the digital collapse. She felt the air change as she reached the lobby. The smell of ozone and damp concrete grew stronger. She pushed through the final set of glass doors and stepped out into the night. Rain was falling in heavy, rhythmic sheets, blurring the neon lights of the city into streaks of color. The cold water hit her skin, sharp and immediate. She stood under the overhang for a moment, letting the sound of the downpour drown out the distant sirens. The city was indifferent, waiting for her next move. A low hum vibrated through the pavement before the lights appeared. Two beams of white cut through the downpour, illuminating the rising mist and the slick asphalt. A black sedan glided toward the curb, its tires hissing against the flooded gutter. Elena stopped. She watched the vehicle slow, the heavy frame of the car blocking the view of the street behind it. It came to a complete halt inches from where she stood. The engine idled with a deep, rhythmic thrum that she felt in her chest. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The rain drummed against the metal roof, the only sound in the dead space between them. Then, the rear window began to slide down with a faint mechanical whine. The glass disappeared into the door frame, revealing the interior. Min-jae sat in the back, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the door frame. He did not lean forward. He did not reach out. He simply stared at her through the curtain of falling water. His expression was a blank slate, unreadable and cold. Min-jae did not speak. He did not need to. In the depth of his eyes, she saw the cold logic of the war he had waged to clear her name. It was not a look of comfort. It was a declaration. He had dismantled her enemies with a precision that bordered on cruelty, and now he sat waiting for her to accept the consequences of that power. Elena looked at the handle. She knew that if she walked away, the city would return to its indifference, and she would be safe. But the moment she stepped into that car, the boundary between her life and his would vanish. He watched her, his gaze unyielding, holding the promise of a future defined by conflict. She understood then that he was not offering her a quiet life. He was offering her a place in the storm. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the sedan, a relentless rhythm that seemed to demand a choice. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. She pulled the door wide, the interior light spilling out into the dark street. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the car. The heavy door thudded shut, muffling the sound of the downpour instantly. The interior was dry, smelling of leather and ozone. Elena sat back as the driver shifted the sedan into gear. The tires crunched against the wet gravel and the vehicle surged forward, pulling away from the curb with a smooth, powerful motion. She looked out the window. The police station, the site of her interrogation, blurred into a smear of blue and white lights. Before vanishing behind a row of buildings, Min-jae finally moved. He reached forward and tapped a button on the console, silencing the ambient hum of the city. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers in the dim light. "There is no going back," he said, his voice low and steady. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact. Elena looked at his hands, steady on his knees, and then at the road ahead, where the neon lights of the district stretched out like a labyrinth. She felt the vibration of the engine beneath her seat, a constant driving force. She did not look back. The sedan accelerated, weaving through the traffic, disappearing into the dark arteries of the city. The choice was made. The storm had begun, and she was already at its heart. The neon glow of the city began to thin, replaced by the rhythmic flicker of street lamps passing overhead. The sedan maintained a steady, relentless pace, eating up the miles as they moved toward the outskirts. Elena watched the reflection of the passing lights on the dark glass. Every mile was a physical distance from the person she had been just hours before. The convenience store, the cramped apartment, the fear of the interrogation room, all of it felt like a dream belonging to someone else. Min-jae remained motionless beside her, his presence a constant grounding weight in the small space. He did not offer comfort, and she did not seek it. Instead, she found a strange clarity in the silence. The uncertainty that had defined her time in Seoul evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She looked at the road ahead, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the darkness. The car surged forward, crossing the bridge that led away from the familiar districts. She was part of the storm now, moving toward an unknown horizon, and for the first time, she did not look back. The highway lights gave way to the absolute darkness of the rural outskirts. The sedan slowed, its tires crunching over loose gravel as it turned off the main road. Elena watched the dashboard screen flicker one last time, a stream of encrypted data scrolling past before the display went black. The digital trail of her past had been scrubbed clean. There was nothing left to tie her to the life she had fled. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the silent black expanse of the sea. The engine cut out. Min-jae opened his door, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Elena followed, her feet finding purchase on the uneven ground. The wind whipped around them, carrying the sharp scent of salt. She stood beside him, looking out into the void where the horizon vanished into the night. The war he had promised was the air they breathed. She took a breath, held it, and stepped forward into the dark, leaving the last remnants of her old world behind. The horizon offered no comfort, only the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. Elena watched the rhythmic pulse of a lighthouse beam far out on the water, its light sweeping over the waves and disappearing into the black. She realized then that the silence between them was not an absence of communication, but a shared understanding. There was no turning back to the convenience store or the quiet anonymity of her old life. That version of her had been dismantled, piece by piece. Min-jae stood a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the same distant light. He did not speak, but the tension in his posture signaled a shift in focus. He turned, his movement deliberate, and walked back toward the sedan. Elena followed, her steps firm on the gravel. She reached the car door and gripped the handle, feeling the cold metal under her palm. The engine turned over with a low, controlled growl. She slid into the seat, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. The interior lights dimmed, leaving them in the dark. She looked at the dashboard, then at the road ahead, and finally, at him. The choice had been made. The war was no longer a threat, it was their reality. The sedan surged forward, tires finding traction on the asphalt as they left the cliffside behind. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the unknown. Elena reached out, her fingers hovering over the console before she adjusted the navigation. A sharp, rhythmic chime echoed through the cabin, signaling that the first objective had been uploaded to the system. She looked at the road, then at the hands gripping the steering wheel, noting the steady pressure of her own touch. Min-jae leaned back, his eyes scanning the periphery, his presence a constant, silent weight beside her. She turned the wheel, guiding the car onto a path that bypassed the main highway entirely. There was no hesitation in her movements. The darkness of the night swallowed the vehicle as they accelerated into the void. The storm had arrived, and she was the one steering it. The city outskirts rushed toward them, a blur of concrete and flickering street lamps. Elena kept her eyes locked on the asphalt, her grip on the wheel firm and unyielding. Without warning, a line of heavy barriers appeared ahead, blocking the main artery. She did not brake. Instead, she downshifted, the engine screaming in protest as she swung the vehicle sharply toward the narrow gap between a construction pylon and the guardrail. The car skidded, tires fighting for purchase on the slick surface. before snapping back into a straight line with a violent jolt. Min-jae remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, checking for pursuit. Elena pushed the accelerator to the floor, the speedometer needle climbing steadily as they wove through the tightening grid of the industrial district. Every turn was calculated, every movement a direct response to the pressure of the chase. She felt the weight of the machine under her control. They merged into the flow of traffic, disappearing into the shadows of the skyline. The storm had found its center, and they were moving with it. The car slowed as it reached the edge of the industrial zone, the engine noise fading into a low, steady hum. Elena pulled the vehicle into the shadows of a concrete warehouse, the tires crunching over loose gravel. She killed the ignition. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. She sat for a moment, her hands still resting on the wheel, scanning the perimeter through the windshield. No headlights approached. No sirens broke the stillness of the night. The city behind them was a distant, glowing haze, indifferent to their presence. She turned to look at the passenger seat, then opened her door and stepped out into the biting wind. The air felt different here, sharp and clean, stripped of the constraints that had defined her life for so long. She walked toward the warehouse entrance, her boots echoing against the pavement. She reached the heavy steel door, placed her palm against the cold surface, and pushed. It swung open, revealing a space that held no history. Inside, the space was vast and hollow, illuminated by a single overhead bulb that swung rhythmically in the draft. Elena walked to the center of the room, where a heavy wooden table stood covered in blueprints and encrypted hardware. She traced the lines of the city grid mapped out on the surface, her fingers stopping at the locations of the rival conglomerate's primary servers. Beside the documents lay a set of keys and a burner phone, their surfaces dull under the harsh light. She picked up the phone, the screen flickering to life. Min-jae stood by the entrance, his eyes monitoring the perimeter, his posture alert and ready. He did not speak, but the subtle nod he gave was enough. Elena pocketed the keys, the metal cold against her palm, and turned to face him. The uncertainty had been replaced by a singular, focused intent. Every action from this point forward was a calculated strike. She moved toward the door, her stride measured and deliberate. The warehouse floor groaned under her weight as she stepped back out into the night. They were no longer running, they were hunting. The city lights blurred into long streaks of neon as they navigated the back alleys toward the target district. Elena kept her pace steady, matching the rhythm of the traffic above. They reached the service entrance of the main server hub, the air thick with the hum of cooling fans and the smell of ozone. A security patrol rounded the corner, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Elena pressed herself into the recess of a doorway, her hand finding the grip of the tool she carried. They waited, breath held, until the footsteps faded into the distance. She stepped out, bypassed the electronic lock with a single, practiced motion, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, the server room was a cathedral of blinking lights. She moved to the main console, connected the drive, and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Min-jae stood guard at the threshold. The data began to transfer, a digital cascade that would dismantle the empire. She pulled the drive, the weight of it confirming the shift in power. They walked out into the rain, the cold water washing away the last traces of her past. They turned the corner and disappeared into the shadows. The rain intensified, drumming against the concrete as they reached the edge of the Han River. Elena pulled the burner phone from her pocket and dropped it into the dark, churning water. It sank without a sound, taking the last digital links to her former life with it. Min-jae stood near the railing, watching the city lights reflect on the surface. He did not look at her, but his presence was a steady anchor in the downpour. The data they had secured was now broadcasting, an unstoppable wave that would force the collapse of the conglomerate. Min-jae turned, offering a single sharp nod that signaled the start of their next move. They walked into the darkness, two figures merging with the night, ready to claim the future they had forged. The city skyline receded, shrinking into a cluster of distant, flickering points. Elena kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the empty road stretch out behind them. No headlights followed. No sirens broke the steady hum of the engine. She reached out and toggled the heater, the sudden warmth a sharp contrast to the biting wind they had just left. Min-jae kept his hands steady on the wheel, his focus locked on the dark ribbon of asphalt ahead. They passed the final toll gate, the concrete barriers blurring into a single gray line. The transition was absolute. The convenience store, the interrogation room, the fear, all of it belonged to a person who no longer existed. She looked at the fuel gauge, then at the map glowing faintly on the console. There was no destination marked, only the open road. She leaned back, the leather seat cold against her shoulders, the engine's drone deepening into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The choice had been made, the door closed, and the future was a blank, dark horizon. They accelerated, disappearing into the night. The highway narrowed, winding upward into the jagged silhouette of the mountains. Elena watched the first hint of gray light bleed into the horizon, a cold, thin line separating the earth from the sky. Min-jae pulled the car onto a gravel shoulder, the tires crunching loudly in the absolute silence. He killed the engine. Elena reached into the glove compartment, pulled out the last remaining documents from her old life, and stepped out into the biting air. She walked to the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping at her, and let the papers go. They tumbled into the abyss. She turned back to the car. Min-jae was waiting, his hand resting on the doorframe. There was no need for words. She climbed back into the passenger seat, the metal door latching with a final, definitive click. He turned the key. They drove forward, two ghosts of the city, vanishing into the light of a world they would now define on their own terms. The descent was steeper than the climb, the road winding through dense, unmapped forests that swallowed the morning light. Elena watched the trees blur past, their branches scraping against the window like skeletal fingers. The engine hummed, a low vibration. They reached a fork in the road, a rusted signpost pointing toward nowhere. Min-jae slowed the car. He didn't check the mirrors. He didn't look back at the trail they had carved through the mountains. He simply shifted gears, the mechanical click echoing in the stillness. Elena watched the needle on the speedometer climb. They were moving beyond the reach of any signal, any law, any shadow from the life they had abandoned. The road ahead narrowed, eventually dissolving into a dirt track. There were no more markers, no more maps. The car surged forward, kicking up a cloud of dust. They vanished into the tree line, leaving the world they once knew. The dirt track ended abruptly at the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the churning sea. Min-jae killed the ignition, and the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves. Elena opened the door and stepped out, the salt spray stinging her skin. She walked to the precipice. Below, the water stretched out toward an endless horizon, dark and untamed. She looked back at the car. Min-jae stood by the hood, his gaze fixed on the distance. There were no more enemies to dismantle, no more shadows to outrun. She breathed in the cold, sharp air, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. She turned her back on the road. The wind picked up, erasing their tracks in the dust, leaving the cliffside empty, save for the sound of the sea. You love powerful real-life stories like this. Don't forget, subscribe to this channel.